Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dursey Davis, and I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am chair of APA's New Urbanism Division, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, October 18th. We will hear the presentation, Path as Place, the Experiential Side of Transportation. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the webcast toolbar to the right of your screen. For your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the questions box located in the webinar toolbar to the right of your screen. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during our Q&A. On your screen is a list of our sponsoring chapters and divisions for 2019. Thanks to all of those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today's webcast in particular is sponsored by the Urban Design and Preservation Division. So thanks to you for joining us again today in this series. We appreciate you, and we'll hear a little bit more about the division and their initiatives here in just a second. Our upcoming webcasts. We are booked now through the end of the year, and we are starting to reserve sessions for 2020. I can't believe it. So you could see a list of our upcoming sessions here. We do have one next week on a Wednesday and also on Friday, and you'll see that we have a few of them. They're pushed back a little bit just to make sure that some of our members out on the West Coast will have the opportunity to view them. So you can register for these webcasts by visiting our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. Today's webcast has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing only. We do have some recorded webcasts that are available for on-demand distance education, one ethics, one law, and you can view those and view the videos and get credit by, again, visiting our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. To record today's CM credits, head over to planning.org and just log into your MyAPA account, and then you can search either by today's title or event number. The event number is there up on the screen. And both of these also, again, are on our webcast webpage if you need them for reference. Let's be friends. Join us on Facebook, like us. Just type in Planning Webcast on Facebook and we'll pop up. That's where we post any up-to-date information or changes or any new webcasts that we have on the schedule that are coming up. And also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click that red button, head over to YouTube and type in Planning Webcast. We'll pop up along with our over 300 recorded videos that we have available for you to view. We have over 2,000 subscribers, so join us because then you can get up-to-date info when we post our sessions, which this session, along with all of our others, is being recorded, and we will post it at the conclusion on our YouTube channel. We'll also have a PDF of this presentation available at the conclusion of the session, and we'll have that up on our webcast webpage, again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. All right, with that, I am going to turn it over to Margaret Rifkin of the Urban Design and Preservation Division to kick us off today. Margaret.
Thank you, Chris. Welcome from the Urban Design and Preservation Division. I'm Margaret Rifkin, the director of our division's webinar program. We invite you to become more involved in our division. You could write for our newsletter, work on this webinar program, help with communications and media, or propose a project of your own. It's a great opportunity to have some leadership. We also have a tradition of running contests with prizes, as you all may remember, which you can enter. Last year's competition, which we held in partnership with the National Consortium of Creative Placemaking, resulted in our receiving some really great short essays and photographs featuring projects from all over the world. So if you would like to see the top submittals, you can find them on our website under writing competition, and you can see the cover of the publication on your screen. Today's webinar on Path as Place is presented by Cindy Zerger and Ian Lockwood of Tool Design. Cindy is a senior urban designer She co-leads Tool Design's urban design group. Her background is in both landscape architecture and urban planning, as is that of the founder of the firm, which is pretty cool. She has a broad range of experience, from complex urban design projects to large nationwide initiatives and that focus on multimodal transportation planning and design. She, like many of you, is passionate about creating exceptional experiences in the public realm, from streetscapes to trails and plazas to parks. Ian Lockwood describes himself as a livable transportation engineer and is a Harvard University Loeb Fellow. Ian's work includes designing flexible public spaces, the design of main streets, downtown revitalization initiatives, and one-way to two-way street restorations and highway removal projects. We're seeing more and more of all of these across the country. Ian is currently interested in popularizing design techniques to ensure that blind people can comfortably participate in the public realm, another matter that is on the cutting edge of urban design. So we're very pleased to present Cindy and Ian. You're up.
Great, thanks so much for that introduction, Margaret. And thanks to all who are here with us. We're excited to share this idea with you, and hopefully it will be both a fun and thought-provoking presentation and dialogue. See if it moves forward here. I know every good planner likes a presentation roadmap, so here's our, as it were. We'll talk a little bit about how we got to here, rethinking our streets, the idea or the concept of path as place, and then go over some examples. So how I got to here, as Margaret mentioned, my background is in both planning and landscape architecture, and I am very passionate about addressing, our streets, arguably the largest part of our public realm, and have had the pleasure to do that here at Tool Design for the last 5.5 years, and beyond that as well at different firms. But I'm really excited to also partner with Ian on this presentation, who's a fantastic engineer with whom I've had the privilege of working on projects across the country. He's committed to advancing important ideas in transportation. And I would say he comes at it from coupling his expertise in engineering with a sense of empathy. He's really passionate about drilling down to what communities want and helping them get to their fantastic ideas with a healthy dose of practicality. So like I said, we've worked together in a number of communities, and unfortunately we have no pictures of us working together. So here we are in different contexts, and rest assured, we do have our Halloween costumes together for the coming event. So now let's move forward to how we as a species got to here. So we're going to roll back a few million years and just talk about, us as a species. We were drawn to this savanna landscape. Really because of the sense of safety and the sense of movement. We could take shelter in the trees and shrubs. The savanna landscape provides a sense of prospect and refuge. We could see our predator and prey in this landscape, but also take that refuge. So this is really ingrained in us as a species. Mind you, 2.5 million years ago, but still part of our DNA. Fast forward a bit, and we are a species that really loves to innovate. So we took that shelter with us and made it into something we could port. As our food moved, we could too. Again, with the innovation, we settled into a more agrarian lifestyle, and we took up permanent shelter. But we still needed to move and transport food to people. So this was a bit of a shift of moving people to food. We were moving our food more to us. We needed better paths in this instance. So these ancient walking trails that we had became cart tracks, which became our rural roads, which you can still see play out on our landscape today. So enter the good roads movement. Our initial paving of our streets, of our roads, of our paths, really was an initiative by cyclists to make it easier. It wasn't really fun to bike on rutted roads, so there was this massive push to pave our roads for better cycling. Again, back to that penchant for innovation. We invented the horseless carriage, but in this instance, this is an example of a prototype by Henry Ford, where the first prototypes were really using bike parks as part of the prototype, like wheels and chains and gears you can see on this one. And of course it worked. The proliferation of cars ensued, and we filled up our paved areas with this new vehicle. And as you can imagine, we filled up the roads, and we're still doing that today. The more pavement we have, the more traffic we have. And I think we can all recognize this isn't a great experience for anyone, whether you're in the car, you're on foot, or you're on a bike. So hold this in your mind for just a little bit, and how we've innovated to create the condition we currently experience. I'm going to pivot a little bit to cities quickly before I turn it over to Ian. We created cities for this purpose of exchange. It was about social, economic, and cultural exchange. We concentrated components of civic life, and transportation and land use were really integrated. And our streets had to be supportive of that. So I'm going to turn it over to Ian now, who will talk about the role that streets play.
Good morning. Pleased to be with everybody, and I look forward to sharing some ideas with you, starting with something that shows up in our textbooks all the time, which is a graph of the role of streets. And in most of our textbooks, it says that arterials are about throughput and local streets are about access, and collector streets are in between. And this is what we've been teaching engineers for the last 70 years. But when you look at real cities, like this one, which is in Buffalo, a lot of our access is on arterials, and arterials are where you'll find, the grocery stores, the restaurants, the services, the entertainment, the jobs, the office buildings. Unless you're in a downtown, chances are these things that we want to access are on arterials. Same in Detroit, you see the same pattern. Same in Hartford, you'll see that same pattern in every city. In Atlanta, even our big cities, you'll see the same pattern unless you're in a downtown or a special district. So it gives us pause with this theory about, modern theory about that arterials are just about throughput, when in fact they're really about access today, and historically they're about access too. Here's a picture of Broad Street in Richmond, Virginia, and can everyone see that picture of Broad Street? Ah, there we go. So there's Broad Street in Richmond, and it's from probably the 1920s. And you can see there's a lot of social and economic exchange going on the street. There's the department stores, the theaters, and all sorts of things going on that street. That's where the transit is. So when you think about that old chart, a more up-to-date chart would be that arterials have a huge access role, and they always have in America, and probably always will have. They have a larger throughput role than local streets, but they definitely have a large access role. And the next slide is a map of Richmond from 1943. And the dark lines are the trolley lines, and the white bars next to the black lines are 3-minute walk contour to the trolley line. And so if you lived in Richmond, you were within a 3-minute walk of access to trolleys, which would get you anywhere in the city. And the big black line down the middle, that's Broad Street, which I just showed you. Now, if you look at Broad Street today, it changed because in 1949, the city switched from what we call traditional values and principles to modernist values and principles. And they decided to get rid of their trolley infrastructure and emphasize motorists, cars, and buses. And so if you look at that same street today, its design has been changed dramatically. And so it's no longer a place, and it no longer supports a lot of social and economic exchange. So the way we conceive of the streets is super important as places where we access things that we need. And so when you think about those two images again, and the more modern definition of mobility, which is the population's capabilities and strategies to move in order to access what we need to live, which provides more mobility. And when we say populations, we say S apostrophe because there's lots of different populations that need to move. It's more than just the movement of people and goods. There's different people with disabilities, people with different income levels, young people, transit users. All these folks have different mobility needs. And clearly the image on the left provides far more mobility for the population, S apostrophe, than the picture on the right. And then the question is, which is a better place? And, this is a place where we want people to live and enjoy. And so again, the image on the left is a far better place. And these arterials historically in American cities were seams that people would join people together as opposed to dividers, which a lot of them have become. And what we try and do is make them, restitch them and change the designs and make them into places again. Cindy.
Another roadway or path example that has really changed from its original function are parkways. Parkways, the first were designed by the father of landscape architecture, Frederick Law Olmsted. The roads did not dominate the experience. It was really meant to be part of it. The way they were designed through a sense of sequence and experience and rhythm, capitalizing on view sheds, were all so important to the way parkways were designed. So this is one example. Let's take the Bronx River Parkway. This is the title page from their construction document set, which I just think is just beautiful. And you can see its original concept up at the top there. It was really the parkway in itself, this road that you see through here, was responding to topography, to view sheds, and working really with the landscape and other systems, railroad, and also the road network. And it was considered more than just a motorway. This is another plan within the construction document. And you can see at this quote at the top, its primary purpose was to transform a polluted river valley into an attractive linear park of recreational opportunities and attractive scenery. So this is just a great image illustration of it in its heyday. You can see people walking, biking, and just lingering there, driving as well. But most importantly, it was a fantastic place to be and experience the place. But in the 1950s and 60s, that was changed. This little quote from the text you can see in the middle, it says, "The roads were changed to accommodate heavy traffic, lanes were added, and things were straightened." And so the term parkway, or this is the parkway as it is today, most of it anyway. And I would say the term has been co-opted at this time in our language. The Merriam-Webster definition of parkway right now is a broad landscaped highway, but that was not its original intent. Another example is our highways. So the original intent of the Federal Highway Act of 1956, or what is also known as the National Interstate and Defense Highways Act, by Eisenhower, the intent was to create a system of roads, of highways to connect cities to each other. It was really about egress. And it's amazing what we can do when we set our minds to something. In 15 years, we built 26,000 miles of highways. Just to give you a sense of scale, that's the circumference of the Earth plus a little bit. And it's an important system to be sure. This was the original intent, where it would link cities. You can see the highways is adjacent to the city and it feeds into the grid system or the network. But what has happened, this is a great illustration Ian drew, and to really illustrate what we ended up with in terms of the highways. We brought it into the cities, can create massive interchanges, huge land needs, and we severed neighborhoods. We raised blocks in the names of highways. Eisenhower said that this was never a part of his original concept and wishes. And that's an important thing to remember. So as we think about the highway system and what it is doing to communities, and we have to rethink what its original intent was meant to be. So it's time, those are just a few examples of how streets or roads and parkways and highways aren't necessarily best serving their communities or the original function. And I'd say it's time we really rethink our transportation for how it needs to serve our communities moving forward. I'm going to pass it off to Ian to talk a little bit about mobility and place.
Thank you, Cindy. 30 years ago, we thought about mobility as the movement of people and goods, and we never questioned why people were moving or how they were moving or the differences between the types of people who are moving. And we just assumed that faster, farther, and greater numbers meant progress. And so we just called movement demand, and we just tried to accommodate it. And we ended up in a bit of a pickle in so many places because of that. But today, many cities and state DOTs are adopting better definitions of mobility. And I touched on it earlier with the Richmond example. that is the population's capabilities and strategies to move in order to access what they need to live within the city. And it is S apostrophe. There's lots of people with different needs. And movement is purposeful. There's certain things we do when we move. There's a whole series of things. And one of them is to go to work, but that only represents about 20% of what we do. The other, change the slide, please. The other 80% has to do with families, visits, doctor visits, going to church, social stuff. So one of the things we can do to increase mobility is actually to mix and densify our land uses. So these things that we go to every day are closer together and our trips are shorter. And this cartoon is an example of good mobility. So hello, mixed land use and density reduced my average weekend trip length by about 85%. So this guy's figured it out. He's got everything he needs on the weekend within 3 feet. And so the idea is that when we design real places, if we can mix and densify the land uses, we can access what we need to live readily. So on the left, there's 4 trips in this diagram. All the trips have to use the big road, and it tends to get automobile oriented, and the trip lengths tend to be long with that sort of automobile scale. On the right, with a more connected networked street pattern, we can take a variety of routes and usually a shorter route, and consequently, those streets can be smaller and more ped friendly, more bike friendly, more transit friendly. And so the diagram on the right clearly provides more mobility, and it's a better place. So when we get to places, we like to ask folks what they want. What do they want their place to be like? And we often talk about it as a vision. And we think about the vision as a consensus on what the place ought to be like in the future, not what it is, but what it ought to be like. And we design for what it ought to be like. And wherever we go, Somerville, Houston, we always see this word place come up. It doesn't matter where we go. It's always place. Knoxville, Charlottesville, all of these visions want a great place. So you're going to see a huge emphasis on the idea of place. Cindy.
So path as place is a term that can be used to communicate the importance of balancing getting somewhere with actually being somewhere. I'll just run through a little definition, and I hope we can have a good, rich dialogue on this at the end, and your thoughts on that. Path is really a road, a street, a highway, a route, really, any linear feature, through its design and composition is all of or part of a place, a defined location or space within the built or natural environment. And I think these are great examples, from a main street to a trail system to a highway. All of them can be path as place. Some other examples, one I think that we all kind of know has become an iconic place to be is the High Line Trail in New York. Certainly through its detailing, through how people move through the space, through the sequence, it feels memorable, like a place. If you were just there on a rail corridor, I'm not sure it would feel that way. Similarly, the Hudson River Greenway, again, very much about going from point A to point B, but it's memorable through the way it's been treated and elements. Even highways, this is Paris Pike in Kentucky, through the sense of working with the landscape, using the topography, local materials, and capitalizing on view sheds, it can be as memorable as a place. As we think about retrofitting our streets, this is happening in many urban conditions now. What are the design moves that we can take to make that experience memorable? So we would argue that path is place. Our experience of path and place is inextricably linked. Sometimes the path and the place are the same, such as the main street up at the top here. They can't separate the two. The experience is one and the same. Sometimes the path contributes to and supports its place, such as in a downtown or a parkway in a park. It contributes, and it's an important part of the experience. And it can never be equal. It needs to be equal, but is never more important than its place. So the movement through, the getting to A to B, is important, but it can't dominate our focus. And this can happen in every context. How we would do it in a more natural setting and then to a more urban core setting is going to look very different, but there are some general principles to how we design and accommodate that design idea. The term itself, or the phrase itself, it really gives legitimacy to the idea that streets are a public space and everyone is welcome there. It gives standing to those who want to dwell in a place, or the static users. The relationships across the street and the edges, really, the importance that it's not the edge of the path is not the end of the experience. It really goes from building face to building face. And as we think about our arterials, sometimes the way they're designed currently is they become a barrier, but they can really become scenes if you think about making them a memorable experience. And that term, really provides a priority and a rigor, I would say, kind of a mandate for those who design and the people who are involved, where the path can really not diminish the place. So we're going to talk through three important elements to get us there. And I think, of course, there's likely more elements than just these, but these are three aspects of the work that both Ian and I do, I think, that have really helped allow us to help communities rethink their streets and making them more memorable. Empathy. The communities in which we work include people who live out their daily lives. Their experience is incredibly important and needs to be genuinely incorporated into the process. So empathy is as a quick definition, is the capacity to see, hear, and feel what another person is experiencing from within their frame of reference. And it's not about sympathy, it really isn't. It's about authentic connection and really understanding. And I love this last part, which is the connection is what inspires the creation of creative, positive, and community-focused solutions. We have to recognize and relate to someone's choice or experience. I think this is a telling statistic that more than a third of the population doesn't drive. And we need to think about that as we design, again, arguably the largest part of our public realm, our streets. Similarly, cycling is a means of transportation. It's not sometimes an option for people. It's a necessity. It's not an add-on or nice to have. And we need to be designing for people who ride bikes. And in terms of we are all pedestrians at some point during the day, and it should not be a humiliating or demoralizing experience. It should be dignified and comfortable, and not just accommodated but celebrated. ADA is an important guidance that we have, but we know that it's sort of the lowest common denominator, or we need to go beyond that now. And Ian will talk a little bit more about that here. We really need to design for that human experience first.
One of the things that I find frustrating, having had a relative who was blind, is how do they find the button? And so sometimes it's like a maze to find a button. And here's a picture of Decatur, Georgia, and there's this crossing where you can't find the button. And you would think it would be on the post next to the crosswalk. Maybe it's attached to the tree or by the bench or the kiosk. But no, it's way back behind the tree on that post. So sometimes it's very hard to find the button. And so one thing I'd like to see happen in the United States is that the buttons be put in a predictable place, and not just have truncated dome warning strips, but have guide strips to help people who can't see find where the crossing is and find the button. And so this is an example at Melbourne, Australia. Now this is at a train station, and these guide strips, you can see them in white, provide a tactile guide for people who are visually impaired to find the ticket window and the gates and all these sorts of important things around the train station. Similarly, at the airport, you can follow the guide strips as well. And then there's warning strips to let people know that there are junctions, so people can turn. And if you kept going straight on this one, in fact, you would get to a kiosk, which gives you information about the transit. And then they're even doing warning strips in buildings to let folks know that stairs are coming up, so you don't trip up or down some stairs. And in sidewalks as well, so that folks know that there are obstacles in sidewalks. If you just change the slide, you can see the big obstacle, and there's a guide, a warning strip around it. Now in today's world, we're replacing a lot of conventional streets and conventional intersections with flush streets and shared spaces. And these don't have curbs, and so they don't have the conventional vocabulary to help people with visual disabilities to get around. So there's a very effective way of doing it, and I'll show you an example. This is in Sweden, and this is a big, busy intersection. There are no signals, stop bars, curbs, or any of the sort of conventional vocabulary. But when you zoom in and look at the pavement, you will see guide strips, and folks can follow those guide strips, and in several places they lead to all the important buildings. So with the combination of guide strips and warning strips, it gives you 2 bits of information, and it's something like Morse code. You switch the slide, you'll see there's dashes and dots, and just like you have guide strips and warning strips, and you can impart a lot of information fairly quickly with 2 ways of communicating through dots and dashes. And similarly, our computers work on ones and zeros. So with two bits of information, you can transfer tons of data information. If we only had zeros in computers, they wouldn't work. So 2 bits really help. And so with 2 ways of communicating with people who can't see, we can help them find their way around the public realm much more easily. So I really like this saying about disabilities becoming handicaps only when we encounter barriers. And if we design sensitively to the people who are most vulnerable, then the disabilities don't matter. They can participate effectively. Back to Cindy, thanks.
Interdisciplinary collaboration is the next aspect. A shared vision is really born of a collaborative environment. K.R. Janssen is a fantastic visual artist. I won't dwell too much on his work, but this quote has always resonated with me for the entirety of my career, that the walls between art and engineering exist only in our minds. And I think that's important to remember, that sometimes the way we define our disciplines is self-imposed. Similarly, a great designer, engineer, and I'm sure he would not want any I guess, description or title, but is Brand Fearon. He gives a great TED Talk. I would encourage you to look at it. He starts with a story. When he was just 9, his parents took him to see the Pantheon in Rome, and it changed everything for him. In that moment, he really began to understand how the tools of science and engineering become more powerful when they're combined with art and beauty. Again, I'm not going to dwell on his presentation, but it's a good one. But I will mention 2 salient points, I think. He talks about the worlds of art and design, and we could insert planning into that, or landscape architecture, whatever words. They're not incompatible with science and engineering. Sometimes we are at odds, but it's not. They aren't. When we combine them, actually, that's when we create great things. And this is so incredibly true, I found, in our discipline, in our focus, is that we are better in each other's company, and we learn from each other when we create together. And the second point he makes is how a creative vision happens. And he gives 3 facets to that. And so I would encourage us to think about a street or a big change you want to make, and making that major shift in that condition. What needs to happen? And he offers 3 things: a brilliant creative vision, storytelling and leadership to fund and execute these projects, and a mastery of science and technology that pushes innovations even farther. And I think these are great reminders that it takes multiple perspectives and multiple champions really to make big change happen. So we all have to wear hats of a creative vision to create a creative vision, and to be leaders in our communities, and to ask for that which we need to change. And it's important to have the right people at the table from the beginning of the project and to the end, I think. When you bring together different disciplines from the onset of a project, you really get to understand what's feasible and what's not. That's really important. I think there's also some opportunities to identify things that aren't necessarily or initially apparent or obvious. When you have multiple disciplines, we're seeing it from different perspectives, and that's important to identify all the potential in the process. And it's much more enjoyable in terms of a process to have everyone there at the beginning, so we're not having to course correct toward the end of a transportation project. Ian's going to talk a little bit about language reform.
I guess I had to take myself off mute there. Okay, so I'd like to talk about language. You've heard a little bit already, but there's this saying that words are the clothes that thoughts wear. And if you go to the next slide, if we assign a good word to a thought, it can tailor people's acceptance of it. For example, sometimes we call crashes accidents, and it removes the responsibility from the agencies and the people involved. If we call widening an improvement, then it's a bias towards those who benefit by the widening and a bias against, for example, in this homeowner, it's against her or the tree. And the term delay, for example, is a negative word, and it's just a change in travel time. Traffic demand is a common term, and it gives an imperative to widening roads because that's what the demand is. And one of the more bothersome words that we find in the sort of conventional lexicon is the word capacity. And the transportation profession defines capacity as how many cars can cross a line in an hour or in a day. But we all know that streets have a capacity to be a great place that nurture businesses and create identity, to host social activities, to be recreational facilities, and create all sorts of wonderful experiences. So the capacity shouldn't be hijacked by just one idea. And so there's all these different words that were coined as part of the modernist movement to support the sort of the motor vehicle-oriented way of looking at cities. And this had some profound effects. These words have solidified ideas and priorities, and clearly something had to be really important to build a space like that. Similarly, words set priorities, and obviously whoever was designing this street put a lot more priority on motorists going through than this gentleman's safety and comfort going along the side. So, and finally, words have consequences. They can shape policy and decisions to create outcomes that are negative, and a lot of that has happened. So we really want to update and reform our language. And so for every coded or biased term on the left, there is a objective or neutral term on the right. So instead of improvement, for example, we can say modification or change. And there are lots of good words that we've come up with over the last 30 years to kind of counter the vocabulary that the modernists created to sort of push the motordom agenda, traffic calming and road diet and smart growth, complete streets, these sorts of things. And we're going to continue to invent new words and terms to describe the community values and what's important in society, to change the paradigm and allow our cities to become better places and allow our streets to become better places. And Path as Place is one of them. So we're going to talk a little bit about a few examples. And to begin with, we'll talk about Winter Garden and the idea of softening hard places. And when I was a kid, my dad was a park designer for the National Park Service. And at supper time one day, he was talking about walking through a forest. And he said it's a great place, a forest, because it engages all your senses, your sight, you hear things, and you feel things on your feet. It's soft, but if too many people follow the same path, it damages the path and it gets messy. So over time, we have to put down stone dust. It hardens the path and spoils the experience a little bit, but more people can use it, and it's easier to maintain. And if too many people use the stone dust path, we have to actually pave the path, and then folks in wheelchairs can use it and on bicycles and whatnot. But the experience isn't the same as walking on the soft forest floor. And so there's all sorts of examples of hard spaces. This is a prison cell. It's a very hard space. And contrasting a prison cell is a living room, which is a very soft space. And if you graph this, the prison cell is a bad experience, not a great experience. The living room is a much nicer experience, but it takes a little more maintenance. Now, the next example is a school classroom. And when I was a kid, this is what school classrooms look like. And it was a hard experience, but it was easy to mop up at the end of the day. Now classrooms are a little different. They're softer, and the kids learn better. It takes a little more maintenance, but it's a better environment. This is a hospital room, a very antiseptic place. Great for keeping the bacteria down, but not a really great place for people. And so now hospital rooms are being softened, and people heal better and have a better experience. A little more maintenance, though. And then in restaurants, this is McDonald's. The chairs are bolted to the ground. It's hard. It's very easy to clean. They aren't bolted to the wall. But in a nice sit-down restaurant with tablecloths and candles, and you'll spend a lot of time there. You'll spend more money. It's a more valuable experience. And again, it takes a little bit more maintenance. Now, if you extend this to the public realm, this is a little open space in urban environment. and it's a hard space. You really don't want to spend a lot of time there. And in this space, it's a soft space, and so you'll spend a whole afternoon here in doing a whole variety of different things. It's a much more valuable experience, even though it takes a little more maintenance. This is a street. It's a placeless street where it's a hard experience and not pleasant to walk or ride. And this street is soft, and you will spend lots of money eating at the cafes and window shopping on this street. So the design really matters about how the experience is and how hard and soft it is. So I'll use the example of Winter Garden. This is Plant Street, and about 20-something years ago, the rail line that went down the middle of the street was torn up, and a path was put in. And the path was hot and dull, and very few people used it. And so we redesigned it, and now it looks like this. And today, that street, which had 80% vacancies on it, is completely full. 100,000 people a month visit that street down that path every month. And the people who come by the path represent 25% of the downtown's economy. So nice paths and great places have large economic roles. Now, when we first designed the West Orange Trail, it was 22 miles long. And today, it almost extends from the Gulf of Mexico all the way to the Atlantic. So people keep adding to it. And as a result, lots of people visit where that star is, which is Winter Garden. And the slide shows on-street parking. And there's a lot of bike parking there because a lot of people enjoy riding their bikes down this fantastic path. And this is what it's done to the economy. There's a lot of people who use the path to get to the shops. And it provides a nice walking environment. People come downtown and just stroll and window shop and do their thing. And the sidewalks are wide, and it's just a really great experience to be here, unlike it was before. And the next example, I want to show Sulphur Springs, and this one's about inclusivity as well. And so the project started off with a dinner. The whole town came out, we had supper, and for dessert, I did the entertainment. I talked about really exciting things like street design and social and economic exchange and views and these sorts of things. And then we had lots of smaller meetings with various stakeholders and agencies. And this is the main street, this photograph. And so it's 17,000 people in dairy country, 90 minutes from the nearest big city. So it's an independent place, and it was dying on the vine. All the economy had moved out of the city, and the young people grew up, went to school, and never came back, and so the place was aging. So the population decided to change this not-so-great place into a fantastic place, and this is the after picture. And right away, investment came, the shops became full, and became a vibrant little main street. So here's a picture of the typical edge of the street, these sort of rundown buildings. This particular one, the roof fell in. And after we did the project, public or private investment came in along the edges and fixed up these buildings. And now it's a really beautiful street. And one day, the city manager was walking down the street with a couple, and they were looking for a place to have their wedding. And the bride just kind of stopped in her tracks and said to Mark and her fiance, "Why don't we get married right here on the street?" And that is the home run for me, that a street is a place where a couple will be willing to share their vows. So it is a great place. This is the square at the end of the street, and they made it into a parking lot to compete with the suburbs, and it just killed the place. The only nice thing in it is the old courthouse. And so we redid the square. And it's interesting to see what it looks like from the air, because it had a one-way state truck route around it. And you can see by these yellow lines that the one-way truck route came down from the north and wrapped around part of the square, and it came from the south. And it wasn't about place, it was about throughput. And so we worked with the Texas DOT and all the stakeholders and businesses, and we changed that view into the following view. And you'll see the before picture and now the after picture. So we two-wayed all the streets. We removed the parking lot, and we put the parking along the edges. Interestingly, we got one extra space when we were finished, even though we got that fantastic open space. And today, at night and day, they have events there. This is a night event, and there was very little happening before. Now they have hundreds of events there all year long, where people come for social and economic exchange because it's such a great place. And here's another event during the day, and if you look closely, and I'll circle them for you, these are the people that you can spot who have mobility impairments. And there's lots of people in that crowd, I'm sure, that they have mobility impairments, so you just can't see them. And so by designing a completely barrier-free environment with no curbs, these people can participate, especially when we close the streets to motorists to increase the size of the square for enormous events. So now people come and they have picnics. There's a fabulous farmers market. There's a whole variety of places where you can set up stages to have music. There's a splash fountain where the young people play. There's lots of places to sit down where the old folks can just sit in the shade and chill and meet their friends. And then there's that hard to reach group, the 12 to 18-year-olds who are too cool to be with their parents, but too young to be independent. And now they have a place to go. And this fantastic place was not lost on the private sector. Somebody bought this building and fixed it up, and it sold for about $19,000 before the project, and now it's worth over $800,000, and it's part of a very valuable place. I'll just end on this rather emotional picture of what I call free-range children. And these kids came to downtown. Lots of kids come to downtown, and they're unaccompanied by their parents. The parents are perfectly comfortable that the streets are safe and easy for children to use. And so that to me is the sign of a great place. It's kind of a canary in the mine. So I'll pass it back to Cindy. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Another example that we'd like to share is a Capital City Bikeway in St. Paul, Minnesota. And this was really a bikeway project, but it was more than that. And it was about really ushering in a new era of streets for the community. A little quick context, this is capital city of Minnesota, actually where I used to live. And the project was born of this 8 to 80 initiative. The mayor had learned about the 8 to 80 and the importance of designing for along that spectrum, and had some additional funds within the city and put that toward public realm improvements throughout the city. But before that, the city adopted its bike plan in 2015 and identified an area for further study, this downtown loop. We knew that it should be a sidewalk level bikeway for the community through its design guidance that had been done previously. But we heard time and time again, it's not just about a bikeway. This is the map of the downtown. As you can see through downtown St. Paul, there is what's called, or affectionately called by the community and client, the donut hole, where you could get to downtown but not through it. So we worked to develop an overall network of what we would call major or minor facilities for the community, and did this through a pretty intensive public engagement process. And concurrent to that, we designed the first segment of the project, a full reconstruct. My engineers tell me it's just about 0.651 of a mile that we designed. Again, we had a really extensive engagement process where we were embedded in the community for 2 one-week charrettes, hearing from folks what they wanted to see. We had a number of advisory committees throughout the life of the project, pulling together different disciplines and different advocates and different technical folks. We met with property owners along the corridor and adjacent to within the overall district. And of course, in a variety of different ways to engage the general public through open houses and pop-up meetings, meeting people where they were at. We held weekly construction meetings throughout the life of the project as well, once we were under construction. And I'm pretty sure we have a public works director in the works here who attended a number of the meetings. From a design process, this is a quick sketch that was done actually in the initial days in a charrette process. And it was what we called the ideal typical section, but it wasn't done by just one person. It was a collaboration of planners, of urban designers, landscape architects, and engineers sitting around the table talking about the potential of Jackson Street to be a real critical street, a catalyst for redevelopment. And so what I think is telling about this section is we really thought about it from the outside in. You can't even see to the left of the section would be the motor vehicle way, but we're really talking about designing the outside first and then figuring out what we could do with the entire street. So this was a rendering that we developed once we knew where the facility was going to be along the roadway. And this is what it is today. You know, you can see through attention to detail, through branding and identity, through capturing the opportunities for green infrastructure. It's become a really wonderful experience to the city, and it's memorable. People know when they're there. So this is a before, quick before, and what it looks like after. Again, we really thought about the intentional experience and the details from the sidewalk all the way through to the bikeway. What I thought was interesting, or what we'd like to share with the project, is that the planning was concurrent to final design, and that can provide some real challenges, but it also provides some opportunities. The city is continuing to think about additional streets, and that experience of designing at the same time as planning helped develop concepts for those other segments. We had a very quick timeline on that to design. We had 9 months to finish the design. A number of committees, like I mentioned, we had no pressure by the mayor. He was leaving office and really wanted the first segment done before he left office. It was fully funded from the beginning, which was wonderful. And economic development was really a driving factor. I think it's telling when the mayor says something about what this did for this community or can do. It's really about ushering in this new era of streets that accommodate all users, no matter the mode or age or ability.
We'll finish up our examples with Chattanooga, which is it's a large project, and it involved Riverfront Parkway, which it looks like a highway, but it had damaged the relationship to the river. And you can see the roof of the aquarium poking out on the left, and the river on the right, with the enormous barrier in between. And we drew a vision of it, and we wanted to remove the highway and put in a two-way, two-lane, more like a city street, with plazas and steps down to the water and paths and views and trees. And we had a really big struggle with the Tennessee Department of Transportation, who had jurisdiction over the street. And they said that the street was the lifeblood of the city, and that you needed to have the highway there for people to get to work. It was about fighting congestion, and removing the highway was anti-progress. And of course, the city was saying that walkability was important, and the place was important, and getting that relationship back to the river was important, and that the highway was out of context, and it kind of damaged the downtown. So here's the before picture. And here's the after picture. And you can see it's a large change. And so now there's all sorts of people who have access to the water. And the good news is, too, by the way, that the Tennessee DOT has changed dramatically. And like a lot of DOTs are less interested in those sorts of old-fashioned ideas. But anyway, now people can enjoy the artwork and get down to the water. They can go right under that bridge and experience the water and the art. It's just a wonderful place. And they have all these big events now. There's all sorts of things happening on the waterfront. It resulted in hundreds of millions of dollars of reinvestment into the city. And the next slide shows an event happening. And if you just go down there, the next slide shows all the sorts of different people that come here for social entertainment, exchange, and it's really changed the tenor of the city because of that, the restitching of that relationship. And I'll put it back to Cindy to wrap things up. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks all for attending and being a part of this webinar. Hopefully some thought-provoking ideas here and the sense of what we mean when we say passive place. So I'll turn it back over to Christine or Margaret to handle the question and answer.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, folks, just as a reminder, if you have questions, just go ahead and type those into the chat box located in your webinar toolbar, and we'll see if we can't get those answered. Okay, first question is I don't know, maybe 20 minutes into your presentation. The question is, what is the source of that trip breakdown information, which is work equals 18% of trips. Could you roll back to that slide and maybe talk about that a little bit?
Yes, Ian, I think that's a question for you.
That goes back to some research that was done by I think it was the Surface Transportation Policy Project, when they were trying to determine why people traveled, and so they got a huge data set and broke down why people were moving, and that's what they came up with. And so there's lots of other information about this too. The average household generates about 9 to 10 trips, and usually 2 or so of those have to do with going to and from work, and the rest have to do with other things. So it makes sense intuitively, but that's where it came from.
Thanks. And Ian, while we have you, I'll ask you another question here. Was there any political pushback on the pedestrian mall design in the first example that you mentioned? And also, do you have any recommendations on how to sell pedestrian scale design to business owners and elected officials?
We didn't show any pedestrian malls. If it's this one they're talking about, a pedestrian mall means you exclude motorists, and all of the examples that we show include motorists. It mixes the different modes in a way that the motorists go through respectfully and slowly. There's a total expectation that you're going to encounter children and pedestrians and bicycles, so everybody's driving very cautiously, and it creates a really nice environment for all the different user groups. It's very comfortable. You can see all the shade. This happens to be in Florida, and it gets really hot, but nobody minds. We were told several times it's too hot to ride your bike in Florida, but if you provide shade and that kind of thing, people will ride. In other places, like in Seattle, I work in Seattle, it's too hilly to ride, but people ride because the infrastructure supports it. And so, there's always political pushback when there's always, in any project, there's groups that feel that they're getting slowed down, usually the motorists. It's usually a clash between what we call traditional values and sort of the motorist type values. If we're changing motorist travel time or that kind of thing, they get upset. But that's what Plaza's Place is for. It's for making the street a public space that if folks are going to use it, they do it respectfully of all the different user groups. And so this is completely aligned with that doctrine of Plaza's Place. And we use it for all of our work, that the motorists should not dominate the place, whether it's a beautiful main street like this or a collector street or arterial or a parkway. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. Next question. Have these projects served to increase the overall modal split for biking, walking, and transit within the respective cities?
I'll start with that. I think, we didn't do before and afters on any of these. But I think anecdotally, we can say from experiencing them, going back to them, there's been a huge shift in how people are experiencing and navigating their cities. Ian, anything you want to add on that?
Yes, I think we could say there's a definite switch. We've seen that infrastructure drives outcomes. I don't have the graphs here, but you can graph bike infrastructure, for example, in different cities across the United States. And as the infrastructure went from nothing to conventional bike lanes to separative bike facilities, a lot more people will ride their bikes. And as we build more comfortable bike facilities, there's 60 or 70% of the population who will ride as long as they're comfortable. And if we provide comfortable facilities, they will ride. And we see it in cities that were very automobile dependent before and that have become very walkable and bikeable. And the poster child is Copenhagen. But we don't have to leave the United States to see that anymore. There's some pretty advanced cities here that are doing that sort of thing. And for example, both Minneapolis and Seattle have grown their populations recently. They've grown their economies, but they've shrunk their traffic. And it's because they are rewarding active transportation, transit, walking, and cycling through appropriate infrastructure. So yes, definitely this makes a difference. And I think in this day and age, with all of the challenges that the planet is facing, I think it's our collective responsibility as professionals to pursue this sort of thing.
Thanks. Okay, next question. The future is here. So how are we planning for autonomous vehicles? And a lot of cities are starting to see things like e-scooters. How are we, and even just regular bicycles where, bike shares, things where a lot of these modes of transportation just sort of lie around and wait for the next person to come about and rent them. So how are we planning for these?
Great question. I think in communities, I'll maybe start and hand it off to you on the autonomous, if that works. A lot of communities, a lot of the scooter and the proliferation of different scooters throughout communities happened before policy was in place. And I think you can see communities now getting a little bit ahead of it and trying to understand the impact of curbside management. So there's a lot of emphasis on identifying locations where to and where not to park different mobility devices, from your motor vehicle to your scooters. In some instances, you're seeing what we call red carpet zones. So even though there's still dockless scooters or bike share, a red carpet zone would be a place where not to leave that device in front of and adjacent to maybe openings to different businesses and things like that. I think that's a critical component of it. I think we are in kind of what I would say a grown zone, where there's some tension in terms of how we're incorporating different types of mobility within our communities. But we have an opportunity to work through that, thankfully, at this time, as we see some communities move forward, and we're learning from that process. Ian, did you want to add to that?
Sure. I think the autonomous vehicle thing is going to be important, and we've seen the tip of the iceberg with Lyft and Uber, and like Cindy was mentioning, curb management is going to be key. And before, the edge of the street was all about just on-street parking, but parking will become less important, and things like loading zones for goods, but loading zones for Lyft riders, Uber riders, autonomous vehicle riders, and transit. That's going to be the important things going forward. And we're seeing it at airports, in particular, where the curb frontage of the airport is just chock-a-block now, because folks aren't driving and parking in the parking garages as much as they used to. They're taking Ubers and Lyfts, and when autonomous vehicles come along, the cost of the driver will be removed, and so this thing we're experiencing right now will be exacerbated. And with respect to things like e-scooters and so forth, we're starting to not talk about bike lanes as much anymore. We're talking them more like lit lanes, light individual transport lanes, where the e-scooters, the inline skaters, the hoverboards, the segways, the bicycles, all these things can use those light individual transport lanes, and as long as they fit in a certain volume, have an assisted speed of no more than 20 miles an hour, and are non-polluting, and have a performance about the same as a bicycle. So they'll be called bike lanes probably for a long time, but they'll evolve into these light individual transport lanes, and then there'll be appropriate parking for those little tiny vehicles on the edges. Thanks.
Great. Next, what tools specifically have you used to build consensus within your public engagement processes?
Yeah, I think that varies from community to community, and you have to tailor it to the needs of the community. But one thing I would say is we often start out with a series of questions to really drill down to understanding values the values that a community has and wants to see move forward. So we ask 3 questions. Ian helped me on this too, but it's what do you want to see your community be like in the future? And so it's asking these really broad questions to really understand what they want to see for the community, and then what do you like? What do you currently like within your community, and what do you want to see changed? Those are 3 really important questions to ask from the beginning, and I know they seem very, simple, but I think what the idea is in terms of that process is getting at that higher level of vision. So we're not all of a sudden just from the initial part of the process drilling down into the brass tacks, but we're keeping it high level. And then from there we can define, figure out what along a street or within a network of streets needs to happen. I think some other things that you'll see or that we employ a lot are, again, getting into the community, being present and being there as designers. Oftentimes we've had experiences in the past or a pretty typical model is designer is in an office somewhere and not within the community, and there you get into a design and defend kind of mode, but doing the design, the initial concepts really in a community makes a big difference for folks to be able to come in and weigh in on the design and what they're seeing. I think also it's been really critical to, as we come into the digital age, to use different types of engagement tools and techniques. So there's the analog or the in-person, but how do we do that digitally too? So people who maybe can't attend meetings are also able to weigh in, and that's a really important component, I would say, of a number of projects we do within our company in a variety of locations. It doesn't necessarily need to be rural or urban, but everyone needs opportunities to engage in multiple ways. Ian, anything you would like to add?
Sure. I think that values thing is probably super important. You're asking the folks what they like and want to preserve, what they don't like that they would like to change, and what's missing and then what they would like to create. And it's 3 views on kind of the same issues and gives you a good idea of what makes people tick. And typically we find that they like traditional values about exchange and proximity and walkability and these sorts of things. And we like to get a consensus on those near the beginning because that helps drive the process down a productive path. And we really like to collaborate. Like Cindy mentioned, we don't like to design and defend. We don't want to do it in a back room then to show people, but rather work with folks. And we have what we call a stakeholder pyramid, where it goes from what we call the veto people at the top who could literally stop a project in its tracks if they chose to, and then all the way down to grassroots. And we want to involve everybody in the pyramid effectively and in the right order, and such that people aren't surprised. And we want to keep it loose so that everybody has a meaningful role in it. And we use an iterative process usually so that we flesh out things in general and they get feedback loops so that we don't go down unproductive tangents for anybody in the pyramid. And by the end, if we're successful, we'll have what we call an informed consensus, where people like the ideas because they have a lot of ownership in them, but they also understand why they like the ideas and they can explain it to their friends. And part of getting that informed part of the informed consensus is by use of what we call capacity building. And in most of our public outreach efforts, there's ways that we help people learn about the issues and the choices so that they can make informed decisions, and they actually have the vocabulary to describe what they're thinking and what they're feeling. So those are the things I would add, and end with just to make a great city. We have a saying: it takes a village. It takes a lot of people to come up with what needs to happen.
Thanks. Next question. Let's see, a couple questions regarding the Sulphur Springs. How were the improvements paid for if the businesses had all seemed to leave and there was nothing happening economically?
So I would say it happened in 2 ways. One is that they did a tax increment finance area. And so as the values went up, the bond could be paid for by the increment in taxes. So that the taxes that went to the county and to the city all went to the area, which paid for the changes. And the second way is that the people of Sulphur Springs built a lot of it themselves. They created a public works department that had really great capabilities so that they could build a lot of it without having to go to contractors, which charge more. We use contractors for the more difficult things, but for a lot of it was built by the people themselves. So there's a tax income and finance district, and a lot of sweat equity went into that project.
Thank you. Next question regarding Sulphur Spring. What was the road surface material?
Yeah, I forgot to add that the VETS community raised over $1 million to help with that dimension. So there was a large sort of ceremonial piece of that project as well. I didn't emphasize it, but it has all the names of every soldier and sailor from the entire community on these special walls that bracket one end of the square. And with regard to this surface material, it's real clay brick, and we worked with the Texas DOT on two-waying the streets, designing the streets with no curbs, and putting down bricks because we needed the texture to help keep the speeds down. And they're also beautiful, so they add to the aesthetic. And so it's still a Texas truck route, but even the trucks that go through, they go through slowly and respectfully.
Okay, thank you. Could you talk more about how you encourage usability for all races and ethnic group / marginalized communities?
In Sulphur Springs or in
Sure.
general?
Just in general.
Okay.
Yeah, I think sure. I think the important thing is making the engagement process very accessible. And again, I'll stress the importance of being in the community to do that. I think it's talking with different groups to understand. Oftentimes, I mean, I'll give you an example from some work I've done in Minnesota in engaging with tribal populations. Is really it's important to understand how they want to be engaged and at what time, and I think that's important to remind ourselves to ask that initial question of, we want to engage, and what does that need to look like for your community? Sometimes those are just really simple questions, and you can realize that some groups want it to be very informal. So everyone's sitting at one table together, or there's no tables involved, and the timing of the engagement is really important. I think also the terminology we use is a really important thing. Like Ian stressed in terms of language reform, the more technical or jargony our words are, the harder it is, or it is to engage with different populations. The more accessible we can make our language, I think the better. I've done some work around engaging with self-advocates as well, when we think about not necessarily different populations in terms of color or socioeconomic background, but in terms of mobility, for example, or ways. That's been super helpful in terms of some of the work I've done to understand where people want to go, why they can't, and ways to design for that. So self-advocates, we did some focus groups in Minnesota for a project there that really helped us understand what needs and what challenges different user groups here. So I think it's authentic communication, it's understanding how to really talk with that community, and sometimes asking the question, how do you want to engage from the beginning of a project is really telling. Ian, you want
I would add, yeah, the outreach is very important. Also, where you build these things, such that all different types of folks can use really nice places. How do we connect these places to the greater community through complete streets and comfortable trails and whatnot, and And then when you get to the place itself, it has to look and feel public. It can't look private. It can't be overly dominated by private uses on the edges, and that's often why we have a public street down the edge of a linear park or something. So people know that they're welcome there, and there needs to be no cost to using it, and no gate, and there ought to be water fountains, and that idea of prospect and refuge for different scales of groups. So you can go there and by yourself and read your book, or you can go there with your girlfriend or boyfriend, or you can go there with your family, or a whole group of people, or a whole July 4th. So it needs to work at different scales so that all groups and members of the public can go. And one of our focuses is particularly on the vulnerable folks. Can you ride there on your bike? Can you get there by foot? Can you get there by transit? Is there a transit facility nearby? And even the most vulnerable people, if you use a wheelchair, or you have a hip issue, or you can't see, can you participate as well? And I think that caring people will feel that as they build, even if they're able-bodied and can see, they will sense that this place was designed to be inclusive, and they will feel welcome.
Next question. All right, the person asking the question says, my city is extraordinarily hilly and the crosstown connections are few and constrained. Do you have a successful example in such a community?
In terms of I'm assuming that's about incorporating bikeways into streets.
Yeah, I would assume so. Yes.
Yeah, I think there are examples across the country. One that I'm kind of new to is San Francisco, where I'm located now. Where there's been some success around bike infrastructure, of course, along the streets in this hilly environment. I think it's not just about infrastructure, but it's about additional incentives that need to happen, programs and policies in place as well to encourage more cycling, which then encourages more infrastructure development. I think, as we see the advent of e-bikes, that makes it much more accessible to a number of population, especially in the hilly environments. So I think it's a combination. There's no silver bullet for some of that, but understanding also network planning and where perhaps the area of least resistance may be for, if you're thinking about a bikeway, maybe the direct A or B route looks like it's the best line on a map, but because of topography, it doesn't really work. So thinking through some of those options and really getting a sense of how to develop that network in a hilly environment is important. Anything you want to add?
I would add, there's places like Seattle has a lot of people using bikes, and a lot of places in Switzerland and other places people ride their bikes quite successfully. I think Cindy's right with all the sort of the design sensitivities to that sort of context. You have to just be sensitive to that and design accordingly. I think e-bikes will help as well. And there's always a reason why you can't design for walking and cycling. It could be, the excuse could be it's too hilly, or it's too rainy, or it's too cold, or it's too hot, or too windy, or something like that. But if you engage with good designers and with a good process and with a good knowledge of the context, I think you can pretty well create a walkable and bikeable place just about anywhere in the world.
Okay, next question. Mixed use trails. What opinions do you have on them, particularly when and where they're appropriate in light of cyclist and pedestrian accidents?
That's a great question. I think we would say, the more defined your spaces can be between modes, probably the better and the safer for everyone. Obviously, we don't have that luxury in every context. But say you have a facility where it is, separated throughout the length of a block. I'm just giving an urban example. What I think is really critical is where folks come together. So the areas at intersections, and clearly delineating that space in what we would call the mixing zone. is really important, and especially giving priority to the most vulnerable users. So that would be your pedestrian. So making it very clear and apparent that pedestrians have the right of way, and that other modes need to either not necessarily dismount, but to slow down through that area is really important. I think in terms of a mixed trail, oftentimes if you have the space for a trail, it's great to be able to even just define it with striping, so the pedestrians know where they should walk and cyclists know where they should be. It's a simple gesture to make sure that people are able to have a predictable space. That's one thing that we would certainly recommend if you have a shared use condition, is somehow defining that a little bit more. And if it does need to be mixed, making sure you're really thinking about the design, the speed that people are allowed to go along that trail. And it's not necessarily a posted speed, but what are some elements that tell people, give them cues to slow down. So oftentimes a trail system that's through a rural air condition, people are going to cycle faster in that condition because there's less what we would call visual friction or vertical elements along it. But thinking about how you slow people down through views and material choices along the edge is really important consideration. Ian, anything to add?
Yeah. So next year, we're currently writing the current AASHTO bike guide and for separated bike facilities. And in it, there will be some great guidance on mixed versus separated, when to do it, and what widths and so forth for different numbers of walkers and cyclists, and when it gets busy enough, you do want it separated. And unfortunately, there's never 14 feet or 12 feet of unused space along the streets where you could just convert to bike facilities or wider sidewalks or something like that. So finding the space is really the key, and it's very contextual, and it's all about priorities. So there's usually the space, it's who gets to use it. And so you need to have a very frank discussion about reallocating space to align with your values and your priorities. And usually there's plenty of space occupied by maybe a parking row, where people, we joke that, people store their private property in the street, and often it gets more priority than an entire mode of transportation. So if you were to remove the parking road, often you have the space, or a car lane. You can have a 5-lane wide street, and then people say they don't have space for separated bike facilities. And so it's a matter of priorities and finding the space in a lot of circumstances. Thanks.
Okay, let's finish up by talking about Chattanooga. What were the driving forces to make such a great change along the waterfront, in contrast to the no change option supported by the highway department?
Well, it was all about accessing the most important part of the city. The city grew up on the river, and in a lot of cities, that's where the flatland was, and that was the industry was, and so there's railways, and it was a really great place to build a highway because nobody really cared about the waterfront. And then today, where cities all over the country are rediscovering their waterfronts, and the industry is maybe not there, but often the railway or the highway, and particularly the highways, are there. And so it's a matter of, again, priorities. The city really wanted to engage its waterfront to add value to its place and to its downtown, and create that engaging edge. And so that was the driving force, was making a great place. And so now the secret to that project wasn't so much in the kind of the before and after picture. It was in the preparation, and getting the network to be two-way and accessible, and reopen streets that were access managed to be closed, and start to evolve the network of the downtown to be more traditional and connected. So there's multiple routing options and so forth, and that helped position the highway to be removed. But the driving force was clearly about making a great downtown and a place. And when you think about it from the basic reasons for cities that Cindy went over about social and economic exchange, the place where that should happen the most is in your downtown. And so the downtown was seen as a place where it was about throughput with this road and not access and exchange and, and then the culture and so on. So it was a matter of priority about changing the space to suit the context. And that, thank God, that's what actually happened at the end of the day.
So there were a couple questions asking when things were moved and rerouted, did it increase traffic volumes on smaller roads? How was that taken into effect? Were there traffic models, studies done to determine what roads were going to see higher volumes? Were there issues with congestion at first? How did all this play?
Well, how about I take that one, Cindy? So this is what we call transfer effects. And what the discussion is if you're doing something for a big road, whether it's on a road diet or slowing it down or making it beautiful, that the people who usually push back against the project are fearful that it will transfer traffic onto a parallel road, usually a more sensitive residential street. And what we're finding is that there are very few transfer effects ever. When the Embarcadero, for example, came down in San Francisco, where did the 120,000 cars go? They didn't go on the parallel route next to it. When we calmed the State Road Olive Avenue from 5 lanes to 2 lanes in West Palm Beach, the traffic didn't just migrate over to the parallel route Flagler Drive. And same with Edgewater, went from 5 lanes to 3 in Orlando. So what typically happens with these highway removals and these road diets is that the place becomes different. The city changes, and what used to be the way people behaved evolves often very quickly, and a lot of that traffic just what's called evaporates, and it's a phenomenon that we're noticing all over. And cities keep doing it, like San Francisco's removed other freeways, and there's no transfer effects. The city just gets better. It changes the city, and so I think this started with this idea that traffic was like a water in pipes, and it has to go somewhere, and it dates back to those ideas because the language is called a demand, and it sounds imperative, but it's really just motor vehicle use and behavior, and trip lengths change, modes change, people move, and the city adapts. And you can see it, for example, in Atlanta, when the highway caught fire a few months ago and was out of commission for 3 months. The city functioned fine. And the 300,000 cars that use that highway didn't just transfer onto the next road over. So I think a lot of the highways that are in our cities are more of a choice. They're not an imperative, but it's a very emotional issue. And the more conventional the engineer or planner or whoever's thinking about this is, the more they think it's a requirement. And it's really just a design choice for their city. At the end of the day, if you actually look at what happens in real life and real projects. Thanks.
Do you have studies that can prove this? Because I suspect that a lot of our listeners would like some concrete example and numbers to put before some of their decision makers who might not be quite on board. Where can we see some of these studies?
Yeah, the best source is probably on the Congress for the New Urbanism website. They've looked at highway removals from all over North America and abroad, and they haven't got all of them, or you can just go to those places and see for yourself. But yeah, it's pretty compelling. The highways that were stopped, Carmageddon didn't happen, and the highways that were removed, again, Carmageddon didn't happen. So the proof's in the pudding if you actually go to the real cities, or if you can read about them on the CNU's website.
And Hashtag Carmageddon. Got it.
Yeah, we're working on 3 highway removals right now around the country, and the more of them that happen, and the more familiar people can get with them, the less fearful and distrusting they'll be of the whole idea. And by the way, the opposite happened.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, when the Katy Way Freeway was widened by 12 lanes in Houston, it filled up right away. And people were surprised. They thought they would be congestion-free for a long time, and it's worse now than it ever was. So it actually works both ways. If you add lots of lanes to highways, you'll get more highway use. And if you remove them, you'll get less highway use. It's just kind of the way it works in real
Just
cities.
habit. Interesting. All right. Ian, thank you. Cindy, thank you. Margaret, you're still hanging around from the Urban Design and Preservation Division. Thanks to you and the division for hosting today's session. This was really interesting. Again, we are recording this webcast. It will be available on our YouTube channel, and we'll have a PDF of this presentation available on our webcast webpage here shortly. Just head over to ohioplanning.org/planning webcast. Everyone, thanks for joining us, and we will talk again next time. Have a good weekend.